My 16-year-old son texted me from a party asking me to pick him up. His friends laughed at him. I've never been prouder. It was 11:52 p.m. on a Friday in April when my phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. I was standing at the sink with soap up to my wrists, half watching a rerun on the little TV my husband Todd mounted under the cabinets 3 summers ago. The dishwasher too full to run again, so I was doing the overflow by hand the way I have every Friday night for years. Ben had left for the party at 8:15, a normal enough send-off. He'd hugged me on his way out, which he still does sometimes even at 16, and told me not to wait up. I hadn't been worried. Preston Cole's house was one we'd heard of as a safe one among the parents in our circle, the kind of party with a pool and enough kids that nobody thought twice about letting their 16-year-old go. I dried one hand on my jeans and picked the phone up. It was Ben. My son doesn't text me during parties. He barely texts me at all. One-word answers, thumbs up emojis, the occasional K. So when I saw his name on the screen at that hour, my stomach did the thing it does, that specific drop that every mother knows and no mother can describe to someone who hasn't felt it. The text said, "Can you come get me? Now, please." No punctuation problems, no slurred typos, nothing that read like a kid 3 drinks deep and looking for an excuse. It read like a kid who had made a decision and needed it executed fast. I called instead of texting back. He picked up on the first ring, and his voice was pitched low, almost a whisper, like he was cupping his hand around the phone. "Mom, I need you to come to Preston Cole's house, the one on Larkspur, off Route 9. Can you park down the block and text me when you're there? Don't come to the door." "Ben, what's going on?" "I'll explain in the car. I'm bringing someone with me." That last part I didn't understand until I saw them both come out from behind a hedge 11 minutes later. My son with his arm around a girl I didn't recognize, walking fast, not running. The way you walk when you're trying very hard not to look like you're running. She had on a jean jacket that was 2 sizes too big for her, and I realized after a second it was Ben's. He'd given her his jacket. She got in the back seat without a word, and Ben got in the front and said, "Just drive, Mom, please. I'll tell you everything." And I did. I pulled off Larkspur without my headlights on until we hit the stop sign. An old habit from nowhere in particular. Just something in me that didn't want the house behind us to register we'd been there at all. Her name was Ivy Chen. She was a freshman, 14, so 2 years younger than Ben, which I didn't know yet meant anything until later. In the rearview mirror, I watched her sit very still with her hands folded in her lap like she was in church. Ben twisted around in his seat every 30 seconds or so to check on her, which is not a thing 16-year-old boys do for freshman girls they don't know. Not in my experience, not without a reason. The reason came out in pieces over the next 10 minutes, in the flat, careful voice Ben uses when he's trying not to sound scared. Preston Cole was a senior, 18, well-liked, the kind of kid whose name showed up on the football roster and also, apparently, on a lot of freshman girls' phones. He'd been at this party for maybe 40 minutes when Ben noticed him steering Ivy toward the pool house with a red cup in each hand, and noticed that Ivy's eyes weren't tracking right, and noticed that nobody else at the party seemed to notice anything at all. Ben said the cup Preston handed her was already half empty by the time Ben caught up with him, and that when he asked Ivy if she was okay, she looked at him like the question took her a full 3 seconds to travel from her ears to her brain and back out her mouth. She said her legs felt like someone else's legs, Ben told me. That's exactly how she said it, someone else's legs. I asked what Preston did when Ben stepped in. Ben said, "Preston laughed at first, told him to relax, said Ivy..."
Sorry to interrupt. Real quick before the story continues. If this story hit close to home, here's the thing. Most people don't figure this stuff out until years later, after it's already cost them something. I put together the manipulation playbook so you don't have to learn it the hard way. 49 patterns, real examples, and exactly what to do the moment you spot one. It's already helped hundreds of people see clearly what took me years to figure out. Links in the description. Okay, back to what happened.
Was just a lightweight, and when Ben didn't move, Preston's voice changed. Got that specific edge some men's voices get. Quiet and mean, and he told Ben this wasn't his business. This was a party for upperclassmen, and Ben should go find his own friends. Ben said he stood there anyway. He said it felt like standing in a doorway with 180 pounds of somebody trying to walk through you, except nobody was touching him at all. It was just the size of the moment. Ben told me the whole scene again a week later, in more detail than he could manage that first night in the car, and by then he could give me the shape of it almost frame by frame. He said the backyard had string lights strung between 2 trees, and a speaker somewhere playing music too loud to talk over easily, which was part of why nobody near the pool house noticed anything at first. You had to be close, had to be looking, to see that Ivy's steps toward the pool house door weren't just tipsy normal, that her hand kept missing the door frame by 2 or 3 inches, like her depth perception had gone somewhere else entirely. Ben said Preston had his hand at the small of her back, steering more than guiding, and that when Ben called out Ivy's name across the yard, he barely knew her, had maybe said 10 words to her total before that night, but he knew her face from the hallway. Preston turned around first, before she did, like he was used to being the one who answered for her. "Everything's fine, man," Preston said, according to Ben, with a red cup lifted in something between a toast and a dismissal. "She's just had a little too much. I got her." "I don't think she's had that much," Ben said back. He told me his voice came out steadier than he expected it to. "I said I got her." That's when the edge came into it, Ben said. Not shouting, just a drop in pitch, a stillness in Preston's face that made it clear the conversation was supposed to be over. That's when the laughing started. Not from Preston, from the 8 or 9 kids who'd drifted over by then, Ben's own friends among them, people he'd known since middle school. Deacon Ruiz, his best friend since 4th grade. was one of them. Someone said, "Bro, chill, you're being weird." And someone else said, "Ben's about to call his mommy," in the sing-song voice kids use to turn a word into a weapon. And a girl named Presley filmed some of it on her phone, laughing behind her hand, the little red dot in the corner of her screen catching the porch light. Ben said he felt his face go hot in a way that had nothing to do with the beer he wasn't drinking. He said for about 4 seconds. He was specific about the number, 4, because he'd counted it out afterward trying to understand himself. He almost let go of Ivy's arm and walked away, because that's what 16 feels like sometimes. That specific gravity of not wanting to be the weird one, the uptight one, the one everyone remembers as the buzzkill. He said the exact thought that got him through the 4 seconds was picturing Ivy's face if he let go, and deciding he'd rather be laughed at by 9 people he barely liked than live with that picture. Instead, he pulled out his phone in front of all of them and texted me. "I figured if I said it out loud, they'd stop me," he said, "so I just did it. I want to tell you I said something wise in that moment, something a movie mother says. What I actually said was, 'You did the right thing, baby,' in a voice that came out cracked in the middle, and I reached back without looking and found Ivy's knee and squeezed it once, and she made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. We didn't go home. I drove straight to the emergency room at Cedar Grove Memorial, 9 minutes away, because Ben told me in the car that Ivy had had exactly 1.5 drinks according to her own count before the wrongness hit her, and 1.5 drinks does not put a 110-pound freshman's legs to sleep in 20 minutes. I called Ivy's mother from the parking lot. Her name is Renata Chen, and she answered on the second ring already crying, because Ivy hadn't been answering her texts for 40 minutes, and she'd been sitting by the window watching the driveway. Renata got to the hospital 11 minutes after we did, still in the sweatpants she must have been wearing on the couch, hair not brushed, and the second she saw Ivy sitting upright in the waiting room chair, she made a sound I'd never heard an adult make before, somewhere between a sob and a laugh. Pure relief with the fear still bleeding through the edges of it. The waiting room at that hour was almost empty. A man icing his hand from what looked like a bar fight, a nurse doing rounds with a clipboard, the vending machine humming under the fluorescent lights. Ben sat next to me with his knee bouncing the entire 40 minutes it took them to call Ivy back, and at one point Renata reached over and squeezed his hand without a word, and he went very still, like he didn't know what to do with a stranger's gratitude. A nurse drew Ivy's blood at 1:14 a.m. The toxicology screen would take 3 days to come back, but the ER doctor, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Okafor, sat down across from Renata and me in the little curtained bay, and told us before we left that based on Ivy's symptoms, the confusion, the slowed reflexes, the fact that she couldn't remember getting from the kitchen to the pool house, even though it was maybe 40 feet, he wasn't ruling anything out, and that he was required by law to file a report with the county the moment anything came back abnormal. He wrote his direct line on the back of a business card and gave it to Renata. "Call me the second you hear," he said. "Don't wait for the office to call you back." I drove Ben home at 2:40 in the morning. Neither of us said much. When we pulled into the driveway, he finally asked, in a small voice that didn't sound 16 at all, "Did I overreact?" I put the car in park and turned to look at him. "No," I said. "You were the only sober person in that entire yard who did math." He didn't answer. He just nodded once and went inside, and I sat in the driveway for another minute with the engine ticking, thinking about the sound that girl made when I touched her knee, and about how close 4 seconds had come to being the difference between my son walking away and my son staying. Todd was awake when I finally came in, sitting at the top of the stairs in his undershirt with his phone in his hand, having tracked my location the whole drive the way we've done for each other since Ben started driving himself places. I told him everything in the kitchen in a voice that kept threatening to give out, and he listened without interrupting, which is not his natural setting. Todd interrupts. Todd fixes things out loud while you're still talking. But that night, he just stood there with his arms crossed and let me get through all of it. When I finished, he said, "I want to call that kid's father right now." And I said, "No, not tonight. Not until we know more." And he nodded, but I saw his jaw working the same way I'd later watch Preston's father's jaw work in a school board meeting. And I understood in that moment that this wasn't only my fight to manage. It took both of us most of the night to fall asleep. I checked on Ben twice, and both times his light was still on, the blue glow of his phone screen under the door. Sunday, the day between, was quiet in a way that felt worse than the noise that followed. Ben stayed in his room most of the afternoon, and I found myself texting the other parents whose kids had been at the party. 6 numbers pulled from an old team roster in my phone. A short, careful message just letting them know their kid might have witnessed something at Preston's on Friday, and to check in with them if anything felt off. 4 of the 6 never responded at all. One mother wrote back a single line, "Kids will be kids. I'm sure it's fine," that I read 3 times, trying to decide if it made me angrier than silence would have, and decided it did. Only one parent, a father named Curtis, whose son Wyatt had also been in that backyard, called me back directly, sounding shaken, and told me Wyatt hadn't been able to sleep Friday night either, that he'd come into their room at 2 a.m. saying he felt sick about something but wouldn't say what. I gave Curtis Alvarez's name in case Wyatt ever wanted to talk to someone. I don't know if he ever did. Monday morning, it was already everywhere. Ben's phone had 340-some notifications by the time he got to first period. A group chat screenshot of the calling his mommy line, a video someone had spliced together with a laugh track sound effect over it, a meme with his yearbook photo and the caption, "Cry about it." Deacon texted him a single laughing emoji at 7:02 a.m., which I only know because Ben showed me wordlessly at the breakfast table, the way you'd show someone a splinter. I want to be clear that Preston Cole was never disciplined that Monday. Preston Cole, as far as the school knew that day, was just a senior who'd thrown a party off campus over the weekend, which wasn't school business at all. Ben, meanwhile, was the kid a small but loud slice of his grade, had decided to make an example of the buzzkill, the narc, the mama's boy who couldn't hang. He came home Monday afternoon and went straight to his room and didn't come down for dinner. And when I knocked and brought a plate up anyway, he was sitting on the floor with his back against the bed, scrolling through the group chat with a face I didn't like at all. I keep thinking maybe I made a big deal out of nothing, he said. That was the night I decided we weren't going to let this die as a joke in a group chat. I didn't say that to him yet. I just sat down on the floor next to him and asked him to walk me through the whole night again, slowly. And I started writing things down on the back of an envelope. Not because I had a plan yet, just because writing things down is what I do when I'm scared and need my hands to be doing something other than shaking. The toxicology results came back on Wednesday. Renata called me at 4:50 p.m., and I could hear in the first half second of her voice, before she said a single word, that it wasn't nothing. Ivy's blood had tested positive for a benzodiazepine, not something she'd been prescribed, not something in her system from any medication, a substance with no business in a 14-year-old's bloodstream at a pool party. The level, the doctor told Renata, was consistent with something added to a drink roughly 20 to 30 minutes before symptoms onset, which lined up almost to the minute with when Ben said Preston handed her that second red cup. Renata filed a police report Thursday morning. A detective named Sergeant Alvarez called Ben in for a formal interview 2 days later, and I sat next to him in a small gray room with a scuffed table and a box of tissues nobody had touched, while he told the story a third time, this time into a recorder, this time with a woman in a blazer, nodding and writing things down that would go into a file with a case number on it. Alvarez was patient in a way that surprised me. She let Ben circle back twice when he misremembered a detail, told him there was no such thing as getting it wrong, only getting it as accurate as memory allowed. She asked him to describe the cup Preston handed Ivy, the color, whether it had ice, whether he saw Preston's hands the whole time or only some of it. Ben answered everything slowly, working to get it right, and at one point his voice caught on the word legs, Ivy's legs, someone else's legs, and Alvarez slid the tissue box 2 inches closer without comment and let him take his time. She told us something at the end of that interview that made the whole thing tilt sideways for me. She said Ben's statement wasn't the only one they'd taken that week. There had been 2 other calls to the department in the past 14 months involving Preston Cole's name, both from parents, neither of which had gone anywhere, because in both cases the girls involved had declined to press further, scared of exactly what Ben's friends had done to him in miniature. The whispering, the blame, the social cost of being the girl who caused trouble for a popular boy. 14 months, I repeated back to her, and she nodded once, like she understood exactly what that number was going to do to me on the drive home. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as one bad night at one party. I didn't sleep much that week. Todd would find me at 1 SAR or 2 hour in the morning at the kitchen table with my laptop open, and he'd stand behind me with his hands on my shoulders and not say anything, because he'd learned by then that I wasn't going to be talked down from it. I was just going to keep pulling threads until I understood the shape of what we'd almost let go of as a joke. I started with a group chat. Ben, to his credit, hadn't deleted anything, even the stuff about him. I read through 6 days of messages and found, buried under 30 jokes at my son's expense, 2 other names I didn't recognize. Girls from the sophomore class who'd apparently also spent time alone with Preston at parties over the winter. I didn't reach out to them directly. That felt like a line I shouldn't cross as an adult and a stranger. Instead, I called the school counselor, a woman named Priya Deshmukh, and asked for a meeting. Priya's office smelled like the same brand of vanilla candle every guidance office seems to have, and there was a bowl of fun-sized candy on her desk that neither of us touched the whole meeting. She was kind and clearly overworked. She told me at one point she carried a caseload of over 400 students. And when I laid out what I knew, Ivy's toxicology report, the 2 prior police calls Alvarez had mentioned, the names in the group chat, her face did something careful and closed off that I recognized immediately as an administrator calculating liability rather than a person deciding what was true. She told me gently that without a school-related incident or a formal complaint from a parent, there wasn't much the school could do, that Preston's party had happened off campus, that this was really a police matter. I asked her directly whether the school had received any prior complaints about Preston Cole. She paused a beat too long before saying she wasn't able to discuss other students' disciplinary records. That pause told me everything the words didn't, and I sat in the parking lot afterward for a full 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I left that meeting angrier than I'd been all week, and I made a decision in the parking lot that I now think of as the real beginning of the documentation phase, though at the time it just felt like refusing to be handled. I started a folder. Not a metaphorical one, an actual accordion folder, the kind with a little elastic string that I bought at the drugstore on the way home. Inside it went a printed copy of Alvarez's case number, a screenshot of the group chat time-stamped and dated, a note with Priya's exact words as close to verbatim as I could remember them, and a single sheet where I started keeping a running list, the way you'd track anything you were trying to quantify: date, incident, source. Renata called me 9 days after the party with the second thing that changed the shape of what we were dealing with. She'd been quietly asking around, carefully, the way you do when you don't want to become the town's cautionary tale, and a woman she knew from her book club mentioned, almost in passing, that her own daughter had gone to homecoming with Preston the previous fall and had stopped talking about him abruptly around Thanksgiving. Wouldn't say why. Cried once at dinner and refused to explain. Renata got the girl's name, Sloane Marchetti, a junior, and, with Sloane's mother's blessing, the 2 of them met for coffee. Sloane told her mother, for the first time out loud, that Preston had gotten her drunk at a bonfire in November, and that she remembered almost nothing of the 2 hours after her second second drink, except waking up in his car with her clothes rearranged, and no memory of consenting to anything. She hadn't told anyone. She was 17 and terrified of exactly the reaction Ben had gotten for far less. By the time Renata finished telling me this on the phone, I was sitting on my bathroom floor with the door locked so Ben wouldn't see my face, because I did not want my son to watch his mother come apart over a stranger's daughter, even though that was exactly what was happening. Alvarez's investigation moved slower than any of us wanted, the way these things do. She asked us in for a follow-up meeting at the station 3 weeks after the Larkspur party, in a smaller room than the first one. A whiteboard someone had wiped down but not quite clean. A ghost of somebody else's case still faintly visible under the marker dust. She told us they'd subpoenaed Preston's phone records as part of the Ivy Chen case, and separately, were now looking into whether a pattern existed across multiple complainants. She slid a single printed page across the table, a redacted summary, not the raw contents, showing a cluster of late-night messages between Preston and Sloan the previous November, timestamps between 11:40 p.m. and 1:15 a.m., the exact window Sloan had described losing to memory. Alvarez used a phrase I wrote down word for word in my folder. A documented pattern changes the calculus significantly. Sloan agreed to give a formal statement 2 days later, in that same small gray room, with her mother sitting beside her the whole time holding a tissue she never used. The third name surfaced the following week, not through the police this time, but through Renata again, doing the quiet, careful legwork none of us had asked her to do, but that she couldn't stop doing. A sophomore named Harlow Bishop, whom I'd never met and never would meet in person, gave a statement through her parents after Renata reached Harlow's mother the same careful way she'd reached Sloan's. A mutual acquaintance, a gentle first phone call, no pressure, just an open door. Harlow's account was the shortest of the three, and somehow the one that unsettled me most. She remembered almost nothing at all, just a single image of ceiling tiles in an unfamiliar room, and the number 46, which she said had been written on her forearm in ballpoint pen when she woke up. No explanation, gone by the time she thought to photograph it. 3 statements, 3 different years, freshman, sophomore, junior, 3 different parties, 1 name attached to all of them. Alvarez called with a 4th piece of evidence in the last week of April, and it was the one that changed something in her own voice on the phone, a flatness I hadn't heard from her before. The subpoenaed phone records had turned up a private group chat, just Preston and 2 older friends who'd already graduated the year before, going back nearly 2 years. Alvarez wouldn't read us the messages directly, not over the phone, but she described the shape of it. A running joke among the 3 of them they called the count, a tally kept casually, cruelly, the way boys keep box scores, references to specific parties, specific dates, a shorthand of initials instead of full names. She said the earliest message referencing the count was dated 19 months before the Larkspur party, which meant this hadn't started with Ivy, hadn't started with Sloan, had been running quietly under the surface of at least 2 full school years before Ben ever texted me from that backyard. This isn't a kid who made one bad decision, Alvarez said, and I remember writing that sentence down word for word too, my hand shaking so badly the letters came out jagged. I didn't tell Ben about the group chat for 4 days. I sat with it myself first, turning it over, trying to figure out how to hand my 16-year-old a fact that ugly without breaking something in him that I couldn't put back. When I finally did tell him, at the kitchen table, he didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then he asked very quietly whether his own name was anywhere in it, whether Preston had said anything about him in that chat, and I told him the truth, that Alvarez hadn't shared that detail, that it didn't matter either way. But I understood exactly why he'd asked. He needed to know if he'd been reduced to a line item too, a joke in someone else's shorthand, the way the girls had been. There was a night in early May, about a month in, when Ben came downstairs at 11:30 and found me at the table again with a folder open, now 3 inches thick, and he sat down across from me without asking and started reading through it himself. He got to Sloan's statement, the part about waking up in the car, and I watched him go very still and very pale, and he said, "Quiet, if I hadn't texted you that night, would anyone have believed Ivy either?" I didn't have a good answer. I still don't. Renata called me a second time that same week, late, past 10, her voice low the way you get when you're talking from a closed bathroom so your own kid won't hear. She told me Ivy had started sleeping with her bedroom door open for the first time since she was 7, and that she'd caught her, twice now, standing at the kitchen window at midnight, watching the street for no reason she'd admit to. I keep asking her what she's looking for, Renata said. She won't tell me. I think she's looking for headlights. I think she's waiting to see if it's going to happen to somebody else and nobody's going to come. I didn't sleep much after that call either. I lay in bed doing the math Renata had done out loud without meaning to. How many other bedroom windows in this town had a girl standing at them right now, watching for the same thing, with no folder, no case number, nobody writing anything down? By the end of May, the folder held 41 printed pages. The group chat screenshots, Alvarez's redacted summary, Priya Deshmukh's near verbatim quote, Sloan's statement, Harlow's statement, a timeline I'd typed up myself with dates down the left margin like a court exhibit, even though nobody had asked me to make one. I labeled the tab on the folder in Sharpie, plain block letters, no drama in it, Larkspur. It sat on the passenger seat of my car more often than it sat in a drawer that month, because I never knew which day I'd need it in my hands. We tried once, before any of this became public, to raise it through the proper channel and have it simply be handled quietly, the way you hope these things can be handled. In late May, Renata and I requested a meeting with the district's Title IX coordinator, a man named Gerald Wexler, along with the principal. We brought the folder. We laid out the toxicology report, the case number, the 3 statements, 2 of which, by then, had been formally filed with the district district as complaints under the parents' names, since Sloan and Harlow were both minors. We asked plainly that Preston be removed from campus pending the outcome of the police investigation, given that classes were still in session, and both Sloan and Harlow attended the same building he did every day. Wexler was polite in the specific, careful way that I've come to recognize as a warning sign in itself. He said the district took these matters extremely seriously. He said Preston was entitled to due process. He said that removing a student from campus without a school-adjudicated finding could expose the district to liability of its own, he said. And this is the line that Renata and I repeated to each other in the parking lot afterward with real disbelief in our voices, that Preston had an otherwise clean record and was a well-regarded member of the senior class, as if those two facts were meant to be reassuring rather than exactly the problem we were describing. We left with nothing. Preston stayed in class. Graduation was 5 weeks away, and it became clear to both of us, in the car, in the parking lot, that the district's calculus was simply to get him across the stage and out the door before anyone had to make a harder decision. I almost broke my own resolve to keep this out of a shouting match 9 days after that meeting, in the parking lot of the grocery store on Route 9 of all places. I was loading bags into the trunk when I saw Preston's father 2 cars down, loading his own trunk, close enough that I could hear him whistling. Something in me came loose. I actually took 3 steps toward him before I stopped myself, folder practically forming in my mind. Every sentence I wanted to say lined up and ready. Then I thought about Ben's face if he found out I'd cornered a grown man in a parking lot, and about how easily that story could get twisted into something about an unhinged mother instead of what actually happened to 3 girls. And I turned around and finished loading my own trunk with my hands shaking the whole time. I told Todd about it that night, and he said quietly, "Good instinct, wrong place," which I've come to think is exactly right. Not every fight is won by having it the moment you feel it. That was the night I decided the folder didn't just belong in a drawer anymore. The school board held its regular public monthly meeting on the second Tuesday of June, open to any resident who wanted to speak during the public comment period. 3 minutes per speaker, sign-up sheet by the door. I signed up under my own name. So did Renata. So, to my genuine surprise, did Harlow Bishop's mother, a soft-spoken woman named Dana, who I'd never met in person until that night, and who told me in the hallway beforehand, hands shaking around a folded piece of paper, that she'd rewritten her 3 minutes 11 times. The room held maybe 80 people that night, folding chairs in rows under fluorescent light, the superintendent and 5 board members up front behind a long table, a table fan pushed into one corner doing nothing against the June heat. I don't know if Preston's family knew we'd be there. I do know that Preston's father, a broad-shouldered man in a golf polo, was sitting in the 3rd row when Renata stood up first, next to a woman I assumed was Preston's mother, who kept her eyes on her lap the entire meeting and never once looked up. Not during Renata's 3 minutes, not during Dana's, not even when her husband stood up out of turn. I've thought about her more than I expected to since that night. What she knew, when she knew it, what it costs a person to sit that still through something like that. Todd came with me and sat 2 rows back with Ben beside him, which I hadn't planned for exactly, but Ben had asked to come quietly, the way he asks for the things that matter to him, and I didn't have it in me to say no. I watched him during Renata's testimony out of the corner of my eye. He sat with his hands folded exactly the way Ivy had sat in the back seat of my car 2 months earlier, and I understood, watching him, that some of what happened that first night had rearranged something in him permanently, in a way I couldn't undo and honestly didn't want to. Renata went through it plainly. The timeline, the toxicology report, the case number, careful never to use Preston's name until her final sentence, which she'd clearly practiced, because it landed clean and hard. The boy who did this to my 14-year-old daughter is Preston Cole, and he has been allowed to remain in your school for 5 weeks since that report was filed. A ripple went through the room, the specific hum of 80 people recalculating something at once. Dana went next. Her hands were shaking so badly the paper crackled into the microphone, but her voice didn't. She read Harlow's statement almost verbatim. The bonfire, the missing hours, the year of silence before her daughter finally said it out loud to a school counselor who then, per district policy, was legally required to report it. A detail Dana emphasized, I think, deliberately, because it undercut Wexler's line about Preston's clean record before I ever had to say a word myself. Preston's father stood up out of turn before I'd even reached the podium, and the board chair had to gavel him back into his seat. "This is a witch hunt," he said, loud enough to carry without the microphone, and I watched his face do 3 things in quick succession that I still think about. First, pure reflexive denial, the mouth already shaping the word lies before it ever fully got out. These girls are lying, or confused, or he didn't finish that sentence, because even he seemed to hear how it sounded halfway through it. Then, catching himself, a pivot to minimizing, his voice dropping into something more reasonable sounding, more rehearsed. Kids exaggerate things at parties. You all remember being that age. One bad night doesn't define a person. He said it looking around the room, not at the board, pitched toward the folding chairs like he was inviting 80 strangers to agree with him on the spot. Nobody gave him the nod he was fishing for. The silence just sat there, heavy, and I watched something shift behind his eyes when it didn't land, the reasonable father voice cracking into something harder. That's when he swung to blaming the girls themselves. "These girls have reputations of their own," he said, and then, worse, looking directly at Renata for the first time, "Maybe ask your daughter what she was doing there in the first place." That was the sentence that broke the room's patience entirely. An audible groan went up. Someone near the back said, "Oh, come on," loud enough to carry over it. A woman 2 rows ahead of me actually stood halfway out of her chair before her husband pulled pulled her back down, and the board chair had to gavel a second time, sharper, and say, "Sir, you will sit down or you will be removed." In a voice that left no more room for negotiation, he sat, but not before his eyes swept the room one more time looking for an ally and finding none, and I watched the exact moment the fight went out of his shoulders. Not defeat yet, not quite, but the first crack in it, the break starting before it was even his turn to speak again. I stood up when it was my turn, and I didn't talk about Preston at all, not directly. I talked about my son. I told them about a 16-year-old boy standing in a backyard being laughed at by his own friends for doing the one decent thing anyone did that night, and I told them that the reason he was laughed at was that everyone in that yard had already absorbed somewhere along the way the lesson that speaking up costs you more than staying quiet does. I said that the district's silence for 5 weeks had taught every kid in that building the exact same lesson, louder than I ever could. I said the folder in my hand had a case number, 3 names, and a toxicology report, and that I would be leaving copies with every board member on my way out, whether they wanted them or not. Preston's father didn't come back up. He walked out during the next speaker, his jaw working, and I watched him go and felt nothing that I'd call satisfaction, only a kind of tired, hollow relief, the way you feel after finally setting down something heavy. The district placed Preston on emergency administrative leave the following morning, 11 days before graduation, which meant functionally that he did not walk with his class. Wexler called Renata and me separately that same afternoon, his tone entirely different than it had been in May, careful in a new way, the careful of a man calculating a different kind of liability, now that 80 residents and a local reporter who'd been sitting quietly in the back row had watched the whole thing unfold. He used the word immediate 3 times in a 2-minute voicemail. I saved it in the folder too. The police investigation, now formally covering 3 separate complainants across 3 academic years, moved forward that summer with a weight it hadn't carried before. Alvarez told us in late July that the department was recommending charges related to the incident with Ivy specifically, given the toxicology evidence, with the other 2 statements entered as pattern evidence to establish intent and history. A local news site ran a short piece 2 weeks after the board meeting. No names of any minors, careful and factual, citing multiple complaints reviewed by the district. And for about 4 days, our street had a few more cars than usual driving past slowly, which Todd found unsettling, and I found, strangely, like the exact opposite. Proof that the story hadn't stayed contained in a folder anymore, that it belonged to more people than just us now, which meant it couldn't be quietly buried the way Wexler had clearly hoped it would be back in May. I'm not going to pretend the legal process resolved itself neatly in some tidy final scene, because it hasn't, not entirely, not as of the writing of this. Preston's family moved out of the district that August, ahead of any arraignment date, into a county 40 minutes north according to the one piece of information Alvarez was able to share with us. Wherever he finished his senior credits, it wasn't here, and whether the system in whatever new zip code he landed in knows any of what happened here is a thread I genuinely do not have the end of. I think about that sometimes, more than I'd like to admit. I hope somebody there is paying closer attention than Gerald Wexler was. Ben's friend group didn't survive the summer in its old shape. Deacon texted him in July, an actual sentence this time instead of a laughing emoji, something short and clumsy that amounted to an apology. That whole thing was messed up. I was being a coward, sorry man. And Ben, to his credit, wrote back something gracious, though I noticed the 2 of them didn't really pick the friendship back up the way it used to be. Some of it just doesn't come back the same size. Presley, the girl who'd filmed part of it that night, deleted her account entirely sometime in June without ever saying a word to Ben directly, which he told me bothered him more than Deacon's silence had somehow. The difference between someone who couldn't face what they'd done and someone who never tried to. Ben made a new friend that summer instead, a quiet kid named Marcus from his robotics team who'd apparently watched the whole group chat pile on in April and privately thought it was disgusting, and never said so out loud until months later, which is its own small, imperfect kind of courage that I've stopped expecting perfection from. The 2 of them spent most of July in our garage rebuilding an old drone Marcus had inherited from his older brother, and I'd bring them lemonade and listen to them argue happily about motor calibration for an hour at a stretch, and it was, honestly, the most normal Ben had sounded since April. It's late October now, a little over 6 months since that night on Larkspur. Ivy Chen started 9th grade like normal, plays JV volleyball on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and waves at Ben in the hallway sometimes, a small private nod between 2 people who understand something about each other that nobody else in that building does. Renata and I text every few weeks now, mostly ordinary things, a recipe, a complaint about the school parking lot, the kind of casual back and forth you build with someone only after you've been through something together that neither of you would have chosen. Sloan graduated in the spring after all. She'd been ahead of the worst of it timeline-wise, and sent Renata a single line through her mother a few weeks back. Tell Ben's mom thank you for not letting it stay quiet. I keep that message saved. Harlow Bishop I still haven't met, and probably never will, and I think about that more than I expected to. How 3 families ended up bound together by a single name none of us chose to have in common. How you can owe someone everything and never once shake their hand. Renata mentioned once that Harlow's mother had asked, quietly, whether Ben would be willing to write something someday for other kids his age about what those 4 seconds in the backyard actually felt like from the inside, not the after-the-fact version, the real one, with the laughing and the almost letting go included. Ben said he'd think about it. I hope he does. I think there's a version of that 4 seconds a lot of 16-year-olds need to hear about. The part where the bravery didn't feel brave at all while it was happening, just uncomfortable and small and almost not worth it. Ben's a junior now. He doesn't talk about that that night much, which I think is healthy, not avoidant. Some things get folded up and put away once they've done their work, and he did his part of the work the moment he pulled out his phone in that backyard instead of letting go of Ivy's arm. The Larkspur folder itself lives in a filing cabinet in our home office now, 41 pages plus everything that came after, and I've thought about throwing it away more than once and never quite managed it. Todd thinks I keep it as evidence in case anything reopens. I think, if I'm honest with myself, I keep it because it's the only physical proof I have that the worst month of my son's adolescence turned into something that actually mattered, instead of just something that happened to him. Last weekend, he drove himself to a bonfire 2 of his robotics friends were hosting, and before he left, unprompted, he told me he'd already agreed with Marcus that if either of them ever saw anything off, they'd text the other one first, code word and everything, half joking, half not. I didn't ask what the code word was. Some things are theirs to carry, not mine to file away in a folder. I think about the 4 seconds Ben told me about that first night in the car, the 4 seconds where he almost let go and walked away because the whole yard was laughing at him. I've decided that's the part of this story I want him to remember longest, longer than the police interview or the school board meeting or any of it. Not that he was brave for the whole night, just that he was brave for 4 seconds, right when it counted, and that turned out to be enough. If you're new here, this is the kind of story I tell. The real ones, sent to me by people who lived them, the ones that don't wrap up as neat as we'd like but end up somewhere worth landing. The full story's linked below and on my channel.